So basically in the free course, all these commits have been extracted from this project and are therefore available for free. Each step has a corresponding video of me on camera, where I really explain each commit, what I want, what I'm going to say about it. And I also provide a lot of information that isn't necessarily directly related to that specific commit. But if, while recording the video, I think of other things, I also explain those topics. I believe that, for example, in one of the first steps, I already talked about SSR, which stands for server-side rendering. So that's a concept that, generally speaking, isn't usually discussed at the initialization of an Angular project, but I talk about it at that point anyway. Anyway, so there you go. Plus, on YouTube, the video for this step 11 is already available, which, by the way, is not included in the downloadable demo project. But there you have it. Let's say it's a kind of little bonus. And then we'll see everything that follows. Since all of this is downloadable, there are explanatory videos available and everything. So I won't dwell on it too much because there are quite a few steps to explain. So I'm moving along a bit quickly because even for a long video, given the amount of information I'm sharing in this training, you need to stay focused. So then in this step 11, we're going to talk about guards. In step 11-2, we'll see that in step 11, I assume you need to move from URL to URL to trigger the guards. Well, in step 11-2, we add the dynamic aspect so that we no longer need to do it manually. In step 12, we're going to talk about subrouters. So we've already talked about routers in the previous steps, and now we'll see that you can nest routers within routers with a depth that's almost unlimited. In some projects, you can go as deep as 4 or 5 levels of routers. It's not necessarily unreasonable, and you could even go further if the need arises. We'll look at a few lesser known but useful guards and how to use them, etc. We'll talk about lazy loading, a major concept that's not unique to Angular or even to front-end development. It's really a purely software engineering concept. So we'll see how to load data on demand, which allows us to limit bandwidth usage, reduce the size of the built application, and thus improve performance. We'll also look at the Angular lifecycle, how components are created, and what their lifecycle is. We'll talk about services, and right after that, how to communicate between components using services. Because up until now, we've communicated between components using inputs and outputs. That's very nice, but it does have its limits. We'll see that with services, we can, so to speak, break through those limits. And we'll also talk about computed, which is a little something added with Angular signals. We'll talk about HTTP services. This is an extremely important foundation in front-end applications because, let's say, almost 100% of front-end applications are meant to communicate with a backend and therefore to communicate using these HTTP services. We'll have a specific section to discuss the core share feature architecture. I've already talked about this several times in previous commits, but here I'm really making a very specific point about it, and in particular I'm introducing domain-driven development, DDD, which will allow us to build applications by thinking a little differently. As developers, we often tend to think technical first, but here we're going to think business first. We'll talk about a crypto transfer feature that will allow us to introduce form controls, form groups, and more generally what we'll call reactive forms or template-driven forms. There's a small difference between them, and we'll touch on that here. So we're going to use these concepts a bit, use form groups, and start working with validators. So in Angular as well, there's a lot to talk about. Synchronous validators, asynchronous validators, how to combine the two. There are quite a few things to cover on that topic. Adding dynamism, how to control the structure of a form group with TypeScript, how it can change dynamically. That's not necessarily well known either. Even among senior developers, there are many who might have gaps in this area because it's not something you need to do every day. But the moment you do need it, if you don't know how, you end up wasting a lot of time poking around, especially with this part. Form arrays, how to repeat a form group multiple times. So this is a part that's often pivotal, but actually extremely important. It's really a new way of developing, you could say. It actually introduces what we call reactive development, meaning reacting to events to trigger well, to trigger software processes, whereas before we were more iterative, going line by line. Here, we're going to rely on reactive programming. So there's a lot to know about this. well, even senior developers, there are several things that can be really interesting to learn. And yeah, this is really going to be a huge section, so it's super interesting to dive into all of that. Next, we'll talk about dependency injection and how to create our own dependency injection tokens. It might be a little early in the course, but since there's a connection that we usually only see much later in our experience, I wanted to include it here to really show that, all right, we actually use them here without realizing it. So with this concept, we'll start to understand a bit why things work this way here. So we're going to use HTTP interceptors, which allow us to intercept all HTTP requests and respond accordingly. The classic case is to redirect to a not found page if there's been an error. We'll handle errors with a specific class. We'll start with change detection, that is the way Angular knows and is able to update the front end, which is the user interface, when a particular JavaScript variable has changed, affecting the overall display. Well, that's thanks to a change detection mechanism with the two classic methods, default and onPush. We also look at two in particular. This is in a slightly more advanced way that isn't always covered when talking about change detection, but it's very important to know. This will allow us to greatly optimize our applications to understand all of this a bit. And also binding. We'll cover binding with Angular signal. What does it change with change detection? It changes quite a lot of things. Running outside Angular, which allows you to trigger heavy processing tasks that would otherwise block the application. Well, we can kind of counter that. We'll talk about Angular signal and we'll remove ngzone, so actually to update the application only through Angular signal. This already works very well. So it's still something quite important, and it actually allows you to remove this dependency on the ngzone library. So yes, there you go, a little comparison. We'll talk about design systems, which are super important in all large companies. They need to have a design system, meaning a component library that will centralize the entire graphic charter of a company so that every application within that company follows the same graphic guidelines. That's convenient, since Angular is very often used in all large companies, so well, it will work very well for that. We'll create our own design system, publish it on NPM to see a bit how that works. We'll use the DI tokens we talked about a bit earlier to see how we can configure the design system for each main application. There are quite a few little things to look at regarding that. We'll talk about some tags that are used a bit less often, but which are really useful. So content projection, which we use a lot in design systems, as well as ng-template and ng-container, which we use a bit less now with Angular 17, 18, 19, and 20, but still they remain useful. We'll talk about CVA. Now, even for really senior, truly expert developers, this isn't necessarily well known or fully mastered. So CVA stands for Control Value Accessor, and it's heavily used in design systems. We'll take a look at why that is. With a slightly more complex CVA, as you can see here on the right, we'll see how to create a picker component that lets you select the month and year separately, while exposing just a single form control to the application. There might be some terms that are a bit complex, but you'll understand everything once you get there, and you'll see that the software engineering aspect of this part in particular is quite advanced. We'll talk about I18A. 18N stands for Internationalization, which is all about translating your application into every possible language. So in my case, I did it for A, so English and French, but there are no limits, you can do it for any language. I recommend using NGX Translate, which brings a lot of benefits and has very few drawbacks. However, if you're familiar with Angular Localize, I'll also take a look at how it works with Angular Localize for this part. But still, I recommend NGX Translate, you'll see. I explain why. Angular Localize does have some limitations, especially when it comes to the truly iterative aspects of the code. So what are we looking at? So, well, cookie management with a with credentials flag, which allows you to send the cookies that were set by the backend. We start the unit tests. It's not always appreciated by developers, but it's true that on many projects, it's really necessary to protect against code regression. That is, if you ever develop a new component, you still want to be sure that your whole application doesn't break. So in small applications, it's very simple. You just go through you go through your whole application again. But when your application has about 100 components, let's say 50 different features, so 50 different pages, it's no longer possible to do it manually, so you have to automate it. So we'll take a look at all of that in this section. So first, what we call unit tests. We'll see how to test services, directives, pipes, and components with signals. We'll see how to use Parion. So here we're going to test the function's return value. We're really going to test functionally what happens. Here we're going to test the execution. In fact, we're going to hook into the execution of a function and be able to say, was the function executed when I did something? We look at code coverage. That's quite visual. It's pretty nice to see. It's about knowing as a percentage, by line, everything, basically where we've gone through in our code. Which part are we not covering, not testing in our code? We'll talk about end-to-end tests. So in this case, having a really visual component. So instead of testing the code part here, we are going to test the visual part here. I'm going to have an automated test, click on this button, and this button, and then I'll ask myself, am I where I'm supposed to be? Or rather, am I where I need to be? We'll talk about NGI Rx, which is a really, really big topic. You see it in large-scale applications, it's very important. It provides robustness, scalability, and significant performance optimization in big applications, and it allows you to structure applications in a very different way. This really allows us to think very precisely about how we do things, where we put them, how we access them, so there's quite a lot to say on that subject. We'll talk a bit about optimization. We'll look at the differences between image formats, the difference between PNG, JPEG, SVGs, what sets them apart. We'll talk about Source Map Explorer, which lets us see if there are any dependencies in our application that are a bit too large. That will be quite visual as well. You can really see it, and it's easy to understand. We'll talk about bundle size, meaning the size of the Angular build. Since our Angular build, and you'll see this in a moment. Once our application is finished, we need to build it. And so when we build, it generates a big website, so to speak. And this website has a size. And well, we'll see that there are impacts on that size. It's important to keep that size as small as possible so it can be downloaded as quickly as possible. We'll also talk about all the different optimizations here. And finally, the Angular build process show to go from our website on our computer to something built and exportable to the internet, with differences in how to build, whether it's for a development environment or for production. And then finally, deploying your application so it's accessible on the internet pretty much everywhere. There are several possibilities for that. So I hope all these steps have taught you a lot more about everything we're going to cover. There are a huge number of topics in this course. Honestly, whether you're a junior developer in that case, you're in luck, you're going to learn a ton of things that most people take years to pick up. And even as a senior developer, feel free to comment if I'm wrong, but I'm convinced definitely some areas in here you're not familiar with, given how many specialized and significant topics are covered in this course. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it gave you more information about everything you could get out of this course, and I'll see you next time.